A Roman senator hosts a banquet. When the meal ends, servants gather the linen tablecloth, streaked with wine and grease, and instead of washing it, they throw it directly into the fire. The cloth does not burn. It sits in the flames, glowing, and comes out whiter than before. The guests call it linum vivum, living linen, and they believe it is woven from the wool of a mythical salamander that lives inside fire itself. 2,000 years before a single lawsuit was ever filed, before the word mesothelioma existed in any language, the people mining that cloth were already dying from it, and at least one Roman writer put that fact on paper. This is the story of a mineral that ancient civilizations treated as a miracle, that medieval kings used to perform tricks for their court, and that the modern industrial world turned into the single largest occupational poisoning event in human history. The warning signs were never hidden. They were written down, filed away, and in some boardrooms, deliberately buried. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a fireproof stone thread went from Roman funeral shrouds to naval shipyards to a corporate scandal that outlasted the men who started it, and why, in the year 2026, this fiber is still legal in the United States. The stone that would not burn had a name in Greek before it had one in English. The word asbestos comes from the Greek term meaning inextinguishable, and the Greeks used it for exactly the property that fascinated everyone who touched this fiber for the next 2 millennia. Deposits of it were mined on the island of Cyprus and in parts of Chalcidice in northern Greece, pulled out of the earth as a soft, fibrous rock that could be carded and spun almost like wool. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history in the 1st century, described a cloth made from this mineral that was thrown into fires to be cleaned rather than washed with water, and he noted that fine napkins made of it were used at banquets for exactly that purpose, pulled glowing from the flames, looking cleaner than when they went in. Wealthy Romans were also buried in shrouds woven from this fiber because it allowed the ashes of the cremated body to be collected separately from the ashes of the funeral pyre itself, keeping the remains pure and undiluted by wood and coal residue. It was a genuine convenience wrapped in the appearance of magic, and for a civilization that worshipped fire as both a domestic tool and a destructive force, a cloth that fire could not consume looked like proof of something close to divine engineering. But Pliny did not stop at describing the miracle. He also wrote about the men who mined it, slaves who worked the quarries producing this fiber, and he noted that they suffered from a disease of the lungs, a sickness tied directly to the material they handled every day. Historians who study the text point to this passage as one of the earliest recorded observations anywhere in the world, linking occupational dust exposure to respiratory illness. Some ancient sources go further, describing crude respiratory protection improvised from thin animal bladder membranes stretched over the face to filter the dust, worn specifically by workers in these quarries. Whether that particular detail describes asbestos mining precisely or a related mineral industry is still debated by classicists, because the Latin and Greek terminology for fibrous minerals overlapped and shifted across centuries. What is not debated is this: the connection between fibrous mineral dust and lung disease among the people who mined it was observed and documented in written form in antiquity, roughly 1900 years before industrial medicine in Britain formally established the same link with laboratory evidence. The knowledge existed. It was simply not acted upon because it did not need to be. The scale of ancient mining was tiny, a handful of quarries supplying luxury goods for the wealthiest households in the Mediterranean world. The industrial world would be a different story entirely. That ancient warning sat quietly in classical texts for centuries, mostly forgotten, while the fireproof cloth itself resurfaced again and again as a symbol of power and mystery. And one of the most famous of those resurfacings involves a man who ruled an empire that stretched across most of Western Europe. Charlemagne, the Frankish king crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, was said to own a tablecloth that would not burn. According to accounts written by chroniclers after his death, Charlemagne would occasionally stage a demonstration for foreign envoys and skeptical guests. At the end of a feast, instead of having the cloth cleared away, he would order it thrown into the hearth fire in front of the assembled table. The fabric would glow and darken with soot, but emerge intact once pulled from the flames, restored to a clean white by the fire itself rather than destroyed by it. To an audience in the early medieval period, a time when fire was one of the most feared forces in daily life, capable of destroying entire wooden towns overnight, this was not a parlor trick. It was a display of supernatural authority, proof that the emperor commanded materials beyond the natural world, and it reinforced the political theater that surrounded Frankish kingship. The material itself, almost certainly asbestos cloth acquired through Mediterranean and Byzantine trade networks that still carried cypress fiber westward, had traveled from the same mines the Romans once worked, passed hand to hand through merchants who understood its commercial value but had no idea and no reason to ask what it might be doing to the lungs of the people who processed it. The legend of fire-resistant fabric did not stay confined to European courts. It traveled east, and it came back changed into something closer to folklore, tangled up with a mythical creature that medieval Europeans were certain lived inside flames. The salamander legend is where the story takes its strangest turn. Medieval Europeans widely believed that salamanders, small amphibians that happened to live in damp, rotting logs, were born from fire and could survive within it, because when a log was thrown onto a hearth, salamanders sometimes scurried out of the wood as it began to burn, giving the illusion that the creature had emerged unharmed from flame. This belief fused with the existence of fireproof cloth to produce a widespread conviction that asbestos textiles were literally woven from salamander fur or salamander wool, harvested from a fire-dwelling beast rather than mined from rock. Merchants selling asbestos cloth in medieval markets had every incentive to encourage this story rather than correct it, because a magical animal fiber commanded a far higher price than a mundane mineral. This is where the man who did more than almost anyone to correct the record enters the story, and his name is one every reader already knows for entirely different reasons. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the late 13th century, recorded in his account of his travels that he had personally visited a region of what is now northwestern China, in the area the Mongols called Qinzhou, where local workers mined a mineral fiber directly from the mountains, wove it into cloth, and cleaned it by exposure to fire, exactly as the Romans once had. Marco Polo explicitly told his readers that the salamander story was false, that no such fire-dwelling beast existed, and that the fiber came from stone pulled out of the ground, not from any animal. He is one of the earliest Western writers to state plainly, based on direct observation rather than second-hand rumor, that the fireproof cloth of the ancient and medieval world was mineral, not magical. His account did not immediately kill the salamander legend across Europe, which persisted in folklore and heraldry for centuries afterward. Most famously, as King Francis I of France later adopted the salamander as his personal emblem. But Marco Polo's writing marks the moment the geological truth of asbestos was recorded clearly enough that any careful reader could have understood exactly what this material was, where it came from, and how it was extracted from mountainsides by workers whose exposure to the raw fiber, generation after generation, remained just as unrecorded and just as unregulated as it had been under Roman rule more than 1,000 years earlier. For nearly 600 years after Marco Polo returned to Venice, asbestos remained a curiosity, a luxury item traded across long distances in small quantities. That would change completely, and violently, once industrial machinery arrived. The Industrial Revolution turned a rare curiosity into a global commodity almost overnight. And the shift happened because factories needed exactly what this fiber offered: heat resistance at industrial scale. Steam engines, boilers, and the first generation of heavy machinery ran hot, and engineers needed insulation that would not ignite, would not melt, and would not degrade under sustained thermal stress. Asbestos fit every requirement, and it could now be mined and processed in industrial quantities rather than the handful of tons that satisfied ancient luxury markets. Commercial mining began in earnest in Italy's Piedmont region in the mid-19th century, but the operation that would come to dominate world supply opened in 1876 near Thetford in the province of Quebec, Canada, where prospectors discovered a massive deposit of chrysotile, the most common and commercially valuable form of asbestos. Quebec's mines would go on to supply a large share of the world's asbestos for the next century. South Africa opened major mines soon after, producing crushidolite, known commonly as blue asbestos, a variety that would later prove to be the most dangerous form of the mineral to human lungs of all. By the final decades of the 1800s, asbestos was being woven into fireproof theater curtains, spun into protective suits for firefighters, mixed into cement for construction, layered into pipe insulation for ships and factories, and pressed into brake linings for the earliest automobiles. It had gone from a Roman party trick to a foundational material of the modern industrial economy in the span of 2 generations. That explosion in demand meant an explosion in the number of workers handling raw, unprocessed asbestos fiber every single day in mills where the air itself was often visibly thick with dust. And it was in exactly that setting, inside a British factory town, where the ancient warning that Pliny the Elder had written down would resurface, this time backed by modern medical documentation that no one could dismiss as folklore. In 1898, a British government factory inspector named Lucy Dean visited textile mills in the town of Rochdale, in Lancashire, England, where raw asbestos fiber was carded and spun into cloth. Dean filed an official report to the Home Office describing what she witnessed inside these mills in blunt terms, noting the visibly harmful effects of asbestos dust on the workers, particularly the sharp, glass-like nature of the fibers under microscopic examination and their evident danger to the lungs and throats of the men and women who breathe them for entire working shifts. This is one of the first modern industrial medical documents anywhere in the world to flag asbestos dust as a specific occupational hazard, filed inside the same decade that asbestos production was scaling up around the globe. It was not acted on with any urgency. 2 years later, in 1900, a physician named Montague Murray, working at Charing Cross Hospital in London, performed an autopsy on a 33-year-old man who had worked for 14 years at an asbestos textile factory, a man whose lungs showed severe fibrous scarring that Murray directly attributed to his occupation. Murray later testified before a government committee that this case represented, in his professional opinion, the first medically documented death caused by asbestos dust inhalation. The industry's own workforce was already dying from it in a country with formal medical institutions, functioning government inspectors, and a physician willing to put his name on the conclusion, a full 3 decades before any regulation existed to protect the next generation of mill workers walking through the same factory doors. The warnings kept accumulating through the early 20th century, but the industry that depended on this fiber was growing faster than any regulatory body could respond, and for years the two forces moved in almost complete disconnect from one another. By the 1920s, enough asbestos workers were falling ill with progressive lung scarring that the medical condition finally received a formal name. In 1927, a British pathologist named William Cook coined the term asbestosis to describe the specific pattern of pulmonary fibrosis he observed in the lungs of asbestos textile workers, distinguishing it from other industrial lung diseases like the coal dust-related conditions already familiar to British physicians from generations of mining communities. Naming the disease mattered because it turned a scattered collection of individual medical case reports into a recognized occupational category that governments could theoretically legislate around. The British government commissioned a formal investigation, and in 1930, 2 government inspectors named Edward Merewether and Charles Price published a landmark report that studied asbestos textile workers directly, correlating years of dust exposure with the severity of lung scarring found on medical examination. and establishing for the first time in an official government document a clear, statistically grounded relationship between asbestos, dust concentration, length of employment, and the onset of asbestosis. The Meriwether and Price Report led directly to the Asbestos Industry Regulations of 1931 in Britain, the first legal framework anywhere in the world, specifically designed to limit asbestos dust exposure in the workplace, requiring basic ventilation and dust suppression measures in factories handling raw fiber. It sounds, on paper, like the system working exactly as it should. A hazard is observed, documented, studied, named, and regulated within roughly 3 decades. But that regulation applied only to Britain, and only to certain categories of dust exposure defined narrowly enough that entire branches of the growing asbestos industry, including the shipyards and construction sites where the material was increasingly being installed rather than manufactured, fell largely outside its reach. And on the other side of the Atlantic, inside the largest asbestos manufacturing company in the United States, a very different response to the same medical evidence was quietly taking shape, one that would not become public knowledge for another 4 decades. The Johns Manville Corporation, headquartered in New York and by the 1930s the dominant asbestos products manufacturer in America, was fully aware of the British medical findings and was generating disturbing findings of its own. Company doctors were conducting regular chest X-rays on Johns Manville employees, and internal medical records that would surface decades later during litigation showed that physicians working for the company were identifying signs of asbestosis in workers as early as the mid-1930s. The most damning evidence to emerge was a set of internal corporate correspondence from 1932 and 1933 involving Sumner Simpson, the president of Asbestos Manhattan, another major asbestos manufacturer, and Vandiver Brown, general counsel for Johns Manville. In these letters, later entered into court records during civil litigation in the 1970s, the executives discussed suppressing unfavorable medical research on asbestos disease and explicitly agreed that company physicians should not inform workers of X-ray findings showing lung abnormalities on the grounds that disclosing the diagnosis would create legal liability and workforce panic. One frequently cited internal memo instructed that if a worker's X-ray showed the beginnings of asbestosis, the man should be told nothing specific about lung damage and should simply be informed that his health was satisfactory, allowing him to continue working and continuing to breathe the same dust without ever learning why his physician had been watching his chest X-rays so closely for so many years. This was not a case of ignorance protected companies from responsibility. It was documented, deliberate concealment, conducted by men who had the medical data in front of them and chose silence because silence was cheaper than the alternative. That corporate silence held for decades, reinforced by an entire industry's shared financial interest in the fiber, right through the greatest surge in asbestos production and use the world would ever see. A surge driven not by peacetime construction, but by global war. World War II turned asbestos from an industrial material into a strategic wartime necessity, and the scale of exposure that resulted from that wartime demand dwarfed everything that had come before it. Naval warships required enormous quantities of fireproof insulation wrapped around boilers, steam pipes, engine rooms, and bulkheads, precisely because fire aboard a steel ship at sea was one of the deadliest threats a crew could face, and asbestos was the material every major navy relied on to prevent it. The United States alone commissioned thousands of new naval vessels during the war, and shipyards on both American coasts in cities like Newport News, Virginia, and along the San Francisco Bay employed enormous wartime workforces, including large numbers of women entering industrial labor for the first time, all working in confined shipboard spaces thick with asbestos dust generated by cutting, sawing, and mixing raw fiber into insulation. Paste applied directly by hand. Estimates from later epidemiological studies suggest that more than 4 million American shipyard workers were employed in trades involving direct asbestos exposure during the war years, and decades afterward, those same shipyard communities would show sharply elevated rates of asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare and aggressive cancer called mesothelioma, appearing in men and women who had spent only a few wartime years working around the material as young adults, sometimes not falling ill until they were well into retirement age. The latency period of asbestos-related disease, which can run 20, 30, even 40 years between exposure and diagnosis, meant that the true medical cost of the wartime shipbuilding boom would not become visible until long after the war itself had become a settled chapter of history, remembered by the very generation now watching this video as living memory rather than distant textbook material. The disease that would eventually blow the entire cover-up wide open did not even have a confirmed name in medical literature, until a South African researcher connected a rare cancer to a specific type of asbestos fiber, and what he found went far beyond factory workers entirely. In 1960, a South African physician named Christopher Wagner published research examining an unusual cluster of a rare and previously obscure cancer called mesothelioma, a malignancy affecting the thin membrane lining the lungs and chest cavity among people living near crocidolite, or blue asbestos, mines in the northwestern Cape region of South Africa. What made Wagner's findings genuinely alarming, far beyond anything the earlier British textile mill studies had shown, was that many of the mesothelioma cases he documented were not miners themselves. They were family members of miners, and in some cases, residents who lived near the mines but had no direct occupational connection to asbestos at all, exposed simply through environmental dust drifting from the mining operations or fibers carried home on a miner's work clothing. This was the moment the medical understanding of asbestos danger expanded from a workplace hazard, something an employer could theoretically manage through ventilation and protective equipment, into an environmental and public health hazard that traveled home with workers settled into household dust and sickened people who had never set foot inside a mine or a factory in their entire lives. Wagner's research, published in the British Journal of Industrial Medicine, is widely credited by medical historians as the study that firmly established mesothelioma as a signature disease of asbestos exposure, and it reframed the entire scale of the problem the industry was facing because it meant the danger was not contained to a defined workforce that a company could quietly manage. It was loose in entire communities. Wagner's findings landed at almost exactly the moment American courts were beginning to hear the first serious civil claims from asbestos workers, and one case in particular, brought by a man who had spent his career installing insulation rather than mining raw fiber, would become the legal turning point the entire industry had spent decades trying to prevent. Clarence Burrell worked as an industrial insulation installer in Texas for over 3 decades, applying asbestos insulation to pipes, boilers, and industrial equipment, a trade that put him in direct, sustained contact with airborne asbestos fiber for his entire working life. By the late 1960s, Burrell was suffering from both asbestosis and mesothelioma, and rather than filing a workers' compensation claim against his employer, his legal team pursued a novel strategy, suing the manufacturers of the asbestos products themselves, including Fiberboard Paper Products Corporation, on the theory that these companies knew or should have known the products were dangerous and had failed to warn the workers who installed them. The case, Burrell versus Fiberboard Paper Products, reached the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which ruled in 1973 in Burrell's favor, establishing a landmark legal precedent that asbestos manufacturers could be held strictly liable for failing to warn workers about known health hazards associated with their products, a legal theory known as product liability that sidestepped the limitations of workers' compensation law entirely. Clarence Burrell himself died of mesothelioma before the court issued its final ruling, but his case opened the floodgates. Over the following 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of asbestos-related lawsuits were filed against manufacturers across the United States. And it was during the discovery process of these lawsuits, with company files subpoenaed and executives placed under oath, that documents like the Sumner-Simpson and Van Diver-Brown correspondence from the 1930s finally became public record, proving in the plaintiff's own words what internal company medicine had known for 40 years before a single worker was told the truth about his own X-ray. The financial consequences for the industry that had built its business on that silence were severe, and one company's downfall in particular reshaped how American law would handle mass industrial injury claims for every disaster that came after it. In 1982, facing an overwhelming and rapidly growing wave of asbestos litigation, the Johns Manville Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, becoming one of the largest and most consequential corporate bankruptcies in American history up to that point, driven not by market failure or mismanagement in any conventional business sense, but almost entirely by the accumulated weight of decades of personal injury lawsuits stemming from asbestos exposure. As part of the bankruptcy reorganization, the company established a trust fund specifically designed to compensate current and future asbestos disease claimants, a legal mechanism that became the template used repeatedly afterward as dozens of other asbestos manufacturers followed Johns Manville into bankruptcy over the following decades, each one setting up a similar trust to handle the ongoing tide of claims from workers who had been exposed years or decades earlier and were only now being diagnosed, given the long latency period of the disease. It is estimated that asbestos-related litigation in the United States has, across its full history, resulted in tens of billions of dollars paid out in settlements and trust fund compensation involving hundreds of separate defendant companies. And the litigation continues into the present day because mesothelioma cases are still being newly diagnosed in workers whose exposure occurred as far back as the shipyards of the 1940s. The disease did not stay confined to shipyards and factories either. Because asbestos had been used so extensively as fireproof insulation, floor tile, ceiling texture, and pipe wrapping throughout American schools, hospitals, and office buildings from the 1930s through the 1970s, the litigation era of the 1980s and 90s also forced a nationwide reckoning with buildings themselves. In 1986, Congress passed the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, requiring public schools across the country to inspect their buildings for asbestos containing material and manage or remove it. A program that ultimately identified the mineral in tens of thousands of American school buildings, many of them constructed during the post-war building boom when asbestos insulation was simply standard practice, not a cost-cutting shortcut. The material's legacy resurfaced again in a far more immediate and public way on September 11, 2001, when the collapse of the World Trade Center towers in New York released a massive plume of pulverized building material into lower Manhattan, a dust cloud that subsequent environmental testing confirmed contained asbestos fibers from insulation used in the tower's original 1970s construction, mixed among the pulverized concrete, glass, and steel. First responders, cleanup crews, and residents who breathed that dust in the days and weeks following the attack have since been monitored for decades under federal health programs, and elevated rates of respiratory illness, including cases of asbestos-related disease, have been documented among that population, a grim postscript demonstrating that even material installed with full knowledge of its risks, sealed safely inside a building for 30 years, could still find a way back into human lungs under the right catastrophic circumstances. The scandal in American courtrooms was matched, and in some cases outpaced, by a wave of outright legal bans moving through governments worldwide, though the pace and the completeness of those bans varied enormously from country to country in ways that still shape global asbestos use today. Iceland became the first country in the world to ban asbestos outright in 1983, a relatively small step in terms of global asbestos consumption, but a symbolically significant one, proving that a modern industrialized nation could function without the material entirely. Other nations followed at very different speeds. Sweden restricted many asbestos uses through the 1980s. Germany moved toward a comprehensive ban by the mid-1990s. The United Kingdom, the country whose factory inspectors and physicians had documented the danger more than a century earlier, did not achieve a full and complete ban on all forms of asbestos until 1999. The European Union, acting as a bloc, implemented a union-wide ban on the manufacture and use of all asbestos products that took full effect across all member states by 2005, closing the loophole of countries within Europe continuing limited use while their neighbors had already stopped. Australia banned asbestos completely in 2003, following its own devastating domestic history with the Wittenoom crocidolite mine in Western Australia, a mining town whose contamination became one of the country's worst industrial disaster sites. Japan followed with a full ban by 2006. The United States, despite being the country where the landmark Burrell lawsuit was decided, where Johns Manville went bankrupt under the weight of asbestos claims, and where hundreds of billions of dollars in litigation and settlement costs have flowed through the court system, has never enacted a complete ban on asbestos. The Environmental Protection Agency attempted a near-total ban in 1989, but that regulation was struck down in large part by a federal appeals court in 1991 following an industry legal challenge, leaving asbestos regulated but not eliminated in American commerce for the following 3 decades. It was not until March of 2024 that the Environmental Protection Agency finalized a new rule banning chrysotile asbestos specifically, the last form of the mineral still legally imported and used in the United States, primarily in the chlor-alkali chemical industry and in certain vehicle friction products, with a phased timeline requiring full compliance over the following years. That rule represents the most significant American regulatory action on asbestos in more than 3 decades, arriving roughly 126 years after Lucy Dean first documented the danger inside a Lancashire textile mill. And the story is not finished globally, even now. Russia remains the world's largest producer and exporter of chrysotile asbestos, with entire company towns in the Ural Mountains, most notably the city of Asbest itself, named directly for the mineral, whose local economy still depends heavily on mining and exporting the fiber to countries in Asia, Africa, and South America that have not enacted bans. China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia remain among the largest consumers of asbestos in the world today, using it primarily in cement roofing sheets and pipes for rapidly growing construction sectors where the material's low cost and heat resistance still outweigh in the calculation of many governments and manufacturers the well-documented long-term health cost that first appeared in writing on a piece of paper nearly 2,000 years ago. That is the arc of this material, from a Roman senator's dinner party to a chemical plant regulation signed in Washington in the 21st century. A fiber that Pliny the Elder linked to sick lungs among slave miners in the 1st century. A cloth that Charlemagne threw into his hearth to awe foreign envoys. A mineral that Marco Polo correctly identified as stone, not salamander fur, 700 years before industrial chemists confirmed the same thing under a microscope. A dust that a British factory inspector flagged as dangerous in 1898, that killed a documented victim by 1900, that received its own medical name in 1927, that a corporation's own lawyers agreed to hide from workers in 1932, that filled the lungs of millions of shipyard laborers during the Second World War, that finally connected to a fatal cancer through a South African doctor's research in 1960, that a Texas insulation worker took all the way to a federal appeals court in 1973, that bankrupted the largest manufacturer in America in 1982, and that the United States government did not fully move to eliminate until 2024. 2,000 years passed between the first written warning and the last regulatory action closing the loophole in the country that fought hardest to keep it open. The fiber that would not burn turned out to be remarkably difficult to extinguish in an entirely different sense, and in several corners of the world today, it still has not been put out. If this kind of story, a material that shaped empires, wars, courtrooms, and quiet corporate decisions made behind closed doors, is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Fabric Myths for more deep dives into the textiles and materials that built the world we live in. Let us know in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most, whether it was the Roman slaves, Charlemagne's tablecloth trick, or the corporate memos from the 1930s, and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if you have another fabric or fiber whose real history you think deserves this same treatment, leave that suggestion below. We read every one of them.